Olá a todos e a todas, sejam bem-vindos para mais um encontro dos Dilemas Éticos. E esse não é qualquer encontro, é um encontro internacional. Nós temos o privilégio enorme de receber aqui conosco David Harris, que é líder do AJC, do American Jewish Committee, desde 1990, foi descrito pelo falecido presidente israelense Shimon Peres como o ministro das Relações Exteriores do povo judeu. E quem vai receber David Harris junto comigo é o presidente da CIP, Mario Fleck, que é, além de presidente da CIP, membro do Conselho do Weizmann, presidente do American Jewish Committee para a América Latina e ativista de instituições judaicas no Brasil e no mundo. Dilemas Éticos nasceram em 2015, na época uma parceria entre a Livraria Cultura e a Congregação Israelita Paulista. Desde que começou a pandemia no ano passado, nós tomamos a decisão de migrar nossas conversas para o ambiente virtual e desde então recebemos pessoas como o ex-presidente Fernando Henrique Cardoso, o ministro Roberto Barroso do Supremo Tribunal Federal, tivemos o privilégio de estar com jornalistas como Guga Chakra, com Jamila Ribeiro, com diversas autoridades e pensadores da nossa sociedade que fizeram com que nós pudéssemos revisitar os dilemas que hoje fazem parte do nosso cotidiano. E hoje não vai ser diferente. A presença do David aqui vai permitir que Mário e eu possamos explorar diferentes assuntos que tocam diretamente a comunidade judaica, o povo judeu, Israel, entre outros temas. Agradecemos os nossos patrocinadores que permitem a realização desses encontros, Ministério do Turismo, Secretaria Especial da Cultura, Itaú, Bemol, GR, CSN, Focus, Helbor e Rossetti, além do apoio da Unibis Cultural. E, finalmente, agradecer a equipe da CIP que está aqui nos bastidores, permitindo que essa transmissão aconteça. Muito obrigado, Ive, Raquel e Natan. David Harris, mais uma vez, muito obrigado por estar aqui conosco. E eu gostaria de te perguntar como nós, da comunidade judaica brasileira, podemos aprender algo com a experiência da comunidade judaica norte-americana. Nós esperamos que, no próximo ano, aqui no Brasil, haverá eleições bastante polarizadas. Como fazer com que a comunidade judaica, com suas diferentes opiniões, permaneça unida? Como impedir que as diferentes opiniões e que a diversidade que existe na comunidade judaica seja um fator desagregador? Com você, David.
Muito obrigado. Thank you, Rabbi. It's a great honor and pleasure to be with you, with my dear friend Mario Fleck, with the members of the congregation for this very special opportunity. The first question is actually a very important, and I would argue a very difficult question, because there is no easy answer. Or if I'll put it differently, if there was an easy answer, I haven't seen it. America is deeply polarized as a nation. I think that's clear to all. We have not yet found the solution to the political polarization. And just as America is deeply polarized, the American Jewish community, in many respects, reflects the polarization. So is there a way to separate the community from the larger society with respect to polarization? I'm not sure, because even issues like Israel and anti-Semitism have been largely politicized inside the Jewish community. So whereas the first assumption might be, well, whatever the American people think about Donald Trump or Joe Biden or whatever the issue may be, at least Jews are united around issues of Israel and anti-Semitism, but that's not true today. It's not true at all. Even Israel and anti-Semitism today reflect some of the political divisions in the larger society. And for me, for the American Jewish Committee, that's a deeply worrisome trend. Because if core issues like Israel and anti-Semitism become politicized or weaponized for the service of partisan purposes, it's unhealthy and it's self-defeating.
Sir David, a gente viu que o antissemitismo, já antes desse último conflito entre Israel e Hamas, ele vinha se exacerbando na Europa e principalmente pela primeira vez nos Estados Unidos, ataques a sinagogas, etc. E agora nós vimos, então, após esse conflito, um recrudescimento completamente fora das expectativas imaginárias, como no distrito do Diamante, em Nova York, um centro totalmente judaico, em que a gente viu ataques a restaurantes, a gente viu isso no Canadá, em Londres. Então, eu queria te perguntar qual é a sua leitura sobre esse recrudescimento do antissemitismo, que lições a gente deveria observar e que atitude e comportamento a comunidade judaica, principalmente, deveria ter a partir dessa experiência. Please.
Mario, I think there are many answers. No single answer is satisfying. First of all, I think many underestimated the durability of anti-Semitism. That would be my starting proposition. There was a sense, maybe it was wishful thinking, maybe it was more than that, after the Shoah, that in liberal democratic societies, that anti-Semitism was receding, and that it was being replaced by full acceptance and participation of Jews in society. And to be absolutely fair, in countries like the United States, that was the case. Compared to 1945, 1950, the level of Jewish participation in American society is extraordinary in every sphere. But that allowed people, and not only in the United States, I think, to allow themselves to believe that after 2,000 years, anti-Semitism was vanishing. It was moving to the margins. And maybe we were all being overly optimistic. So that's the first point. The second point for me is that after the war, since Hitler and the Nazis gave anti-Semitism such a bad name, and since Stalin and the communists gave anti-Semitism such a bad name, much of the anti-Semitic energy transferred from the individual Jew, you, Mario, and me, to the collective Jew, the state of Israel. And I think, again, we underestimate how much of the hostility towards Israel is connected to the fact that Israel is the only Jewish majority nation on earth. How else to explain some of the obsession, Mario, the obsession of countries and institutions with everything that happens in Israel? I don't know how else to explain it. I'm not here to defend Israel as a perfect country. But if we take the most recent events, from my perspective, you could not have a more clear-cut distinction between the aggressor, Hamas, between the victim, Israel, between the theological, genocidal ideology of Hamas and the liberal democratic values of the state of Israel. It could not be more clear-cut. And yet we're told tens and hundreds of thousands of people have been marching in capitals across the Western world in favor of the Palestinians, which in this case does mean Hamas, whether they use the word or not, and in fierce opposition to the state of Israel. So how else to explain it? By the way, can any of us remember marches that came even close in size and intensity to any other human rights challenge in the world of late? I can't. And again, I repeat, Israel was seeking to defend itself against an onslaught of missiles designed to do as much damage as possible missiles fired by Hamas, funded and supported by Iran. The third thing is, I believe that we're living in a world where the Holocaust is receding in memory as a kind of break on anti-Semitism. What the Holocaust should have taught was the slippery slope that begins with words. I hate Jews. Jews are subhuman, and moves step by step from words to laws to actions to crematoria. Well, we live in a world now which is largely uninterested and indifferent to history, generally speaking. Start a conversation, Mario, with anyone by a historical reference, whether it's Jewish or non-Jewish, and watch the reaction. In many cases, you've already lost them. So the Holocaust, the eyewitnesses, the survivors, the liberators are largely gone or quickly disappearing. So the hold of the Holocaust on the consciousness of the world is diminishing. Number 4, social media. I have no doubt that when the initial companies created the social media platforms, they saw the good, the great possibilities for all of us. And I think we've all benefited. I'm not sure that they fully saw the potential for evil, the dissemination of genocide and incitement, anti-Semitism, racism, hatred. But if one studies now anti-Semitism as we do here at AJC, it usually comes right back to social media. And the last thing I would say for now, in trying to respond to what's different, is I think the liberal democracy that I spoke about, which with all of its faults represents the best hope for Jews, I'd say for all minorities, and I'd say for all humankind, is now competing with 2 alternative visions, including here in the United States. One vision I call the radical right vision, and the other vision I call the totalitarian left vision. And the basic assumptions of American society that kept us largely connected, if not glued together for decades, are unraveling. And I don't have to tell this audience, I'm sure, the radical right poses a threat to democracy as we know it, to mutual respect as we know it, and directly to Jews. And the totalitarian left represents a threat to democracy. It represents a threat to mutual respect, and yes, a direct threat to Jews. And right now, we have a 3-front war in the United States among the radical right, the totalitarian left, and let's call it the liberal democratic center.
Very interesting, David. And the learning from this, if I can just extend a little bit, what's your advice? What's your agenda? I know that I know you for many, many years. I know your concerns on the topic agendas for yourself as leader of AJC and for AJC as an institution. So how this will transform the agenda of AJC in the near future?
I think in 2 ways in particular, Mario. First, we are a Jewish organization. We're also an American organization and a global organization. And we are going to intensify our defense of liberal democratic values. That means the rule of law, democratic transparency, protection of minority rights, respect for differences of opinion, the search for consensus in the country, because we as Jews have a stake in the stability of the United States. We can't separate ourselves as if our own destiny is disconnected from the societies in which we live. And secondly, we've long focused on issues of hatred and bigotry and racism. And sometimes we've even submerged the focus on anti-Semitism because many thought it was vanishing. We are intensifying our focus on anti-Semitism, but Mario, with an emphasis on messaging that anti-Semitism should not be seen as a Jewish problem for Jews to defend against and to solve by themselves. Anti-Semitism rather should be seen as a cancer in any society that left unchecked will metastasize and ultimately could destroy the larger society. We know it, you know it. Jews are only the beginning of the story, not the end of the story. The end of the story is our countries, our societies as we know them. So we have to focus more attention on anti-Semitism and at the same time try to educate the larger societies, our natural partners, that our fight is your fight and your fight is our fight and we are stronger together.
David, eu sei que o American Jewish Committee dedica muita energia para a questão do diálogo interreligioso. Como representante da Confederação Israelita do Brasil para o diálogo interreligioso, eu gostaria de te perguntar quais são as oportunidades e os desafios do diálogo interreligioso nos nossos tempos, em geral, e em particular em relação à comunidade cristã, seja ela católica ou não, e em relação aos muçulmanos.
So I appreciate the question, Rabbi. As you mentioned, we at American Jewish Committee have been involved in interfaith dialogue now for close to a century. And if I can generalize, our main focus in the 20th century, I go back to history for a moment, was on the Christian world. And I think we made enormous progress, in particular with the revolutionary decision of the Catholic Church in 1965 to adopt Nostra Aetate, which effectively ended the centuries of teaching the deicide charge and the teaching of contempt of Jews. No one should underestimate the significance of that decision. And AJC quietly for many years encouraged our friends in the Catholic Church to move in that direction. I would argue that the main challenge we at AJC have established for the 21st century is Muslim-Jewish relations. And here we have a good story to tell, but it's a complicated story. It's a story that will not have a clear end, the same way we did with the Catholic Church. And the reason should be quite familiar to Jews. The Catholic Church has a hierarchy. It has a pyramid. And at the top of the pyramid sits the Pope, and in turn, the College of Cardinals. So if the Pope and the College of Cardinals reaches a historic decision, as they did in 1965, and adopts it, it is valid for the entire Catholic Church from Brazil to Guatemala to Ireland to Poland to Nigeria. Now, it may take time to implement. It has to trickle down from Rome to the local parish churches. There are pockets of resistance. But the fact of the matter is, the change in direction in 1965 was dramatic. And those of us who lived through it can say it was a veritable revolution, a good revolution. The challenge with Muslim-Jewish relations is, in this case, there is no Pope. There is no College of Cardinals. Like our religion, it is a more horizontal religion. And therefore, we have to do this, as we say here in the United States, more in a retail fashion. Mosque by mosque, imam by imam, community by community, country by country, seminary by seminary. And even as we enjoy many successes, new partnerships, new dialogues, new areas of cooperation, we know that the journey's not over because there are other forces. Gaza is a reminder. Gaza is driven by a theological interpretation of Islam, an affiliation with the Muslim Brotherhood, and at the same time, an affiliation with Iran, another theologically driven organization, a country. Now, people can say they don't represent Islam, but it's not so simple. They believe they're representing Islam. They believe they're representing their interpretation of Islam. And as a consequence, we have both the good news of many new partnerships, and I can speak about one in particular, but at the same time, the ongoing threats and challenges that we see. So how this ends remains to be seen. There's no target. There's no College of Cardinals. There's no Holy See or Vatican. But still, there are important addresses. In April of 2019, Rabbi, AJC signed a partnership with the Muslim World League. Now, the Muslim World League is headquartered in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. Not here in New York or Boston, in Mecca. The head of the Muslim World League is appointed by the King of Saudi Arabia, who, let's remember, is the custodian of the two holy mosques in Mecca and Medina. We signed that memorandum of understanding, and it included several component parts. The first of which was that we would travel together to Auschwitz and Birkenau in January of 2020 to mark the 75th anniversary of the liberation of these Nazi death camps. And I wish that you, Rabbi, and Mario Fleck, and everyone watching this program could have joined us as together we marched under those infamous words, Arbeit macht frei, Muslims and Jews, arm in arm, 62 Muslim leaders from around the world led by the head of the Muslim World League and the American Jewish Committee, and followed by Al Arabiya and the BBC and the New York Times and most of the other major influential media outlets. And we spent 5 hours in Auschwitz and Birkenau. And I could see with my own eyes the impact. Perhaps some of our Muslim friends came with a skepticism. After all, Holocaust denial, Holocaust trivialization is quite present in parts of the Muslim world. But the more they saw, the more they realized that an unspeakable tragedy had occurred there. And by the end of the 5 hours before we left Birkenau, maybe 10 or 15 meters from the remains of the crematoria, they pulled out their prayer rugs and they conducted a memorial service, a Muslim memorial service for the victims of Auschwitz and Birkenau. And in that moment, not only were we powerfully moved, but we felt a step forward. We need more such steps forward in Saudi Arabia, in Auschwitz, in Sao Paulo, in New York, wherever. We need more such steps forward. And I'll add just one thing. I believe that the Abraham Accords of last year, the fact that we went from 2 to 6 Arab countries who have now normalized relations with Israel, gives us another good opportunity. Because the more Jews and Muslims interact, not from a distance, but interact as students, in business, in culture, as tourists, the more we humanize each other. The radicals want to dehumanize the other side. And it's easy from a distance. If you've never met a Jew, so you believe the imam who says Jews are the children of apes and pigs. But once you meet a Jew and you realize that the Jew, like you, is a human who laughs, who cries, who hurts, who has a family, who has dreams, who has hopes, who has fears, once you humanize each other, a big step is taken. So the more we can bring Jews and Arabs and Israelis and Muslims together and learn from each other, I think the more we have a chance of making this the revolution of the 21st century.
David, could you add some lines on the dialogue with evangelicals?
So this is often a question for us in the United States, and I understand fully that the evangelical community is very strong in Brazil and elsewhere in Latin America, including in much of Central America. And the question here, I'll speak in American terms, Rabbi, is, well, should we be engaged with the evangelicals? Don't they want to convert us? Don't they believe that they need us to fulfill their own eschatology, their own rapture, their own end of days? And don't they have a different sort of politics around some of the key issues that we Jews also care about domestically? And I'll be very honest with you. Number one, I'm not convertible. The Jews who keep saying they want to convert us, and my response is, no one's going to convert someone who's not ready to be converted. So why are you afraid? They're not kidnapping you. They're trying to convert you through their own form of love, attention. I'm not convertible. I'm a proud Jew. I have no desire to be anything else but a proud Jew. I respect other people's faith and religion. I have no desire to convert them. In fact, I have a desire to protect their right to be who they wish to be. So I'm not afraid of evangelicals. Evangelicals, by and large, have a very strong support for Israel, as we know. They often even have the Israeli flag on what we would call the bima. I'm not sure it's the word that they would use in their churches, but on their dais or platform. From my perspective, thank you very much. If your thought process, whether it's political, philosophical, or religious, leads you to want to support Israel, we need friends. We don't have an overabundance of friends that we can afford to say, no, thank you, no, thank you. We need friends. And I have to say, in my 30 years in this job at AJC, no evangelical leader has ever asked of us anything in exchange. So for them, it's not a transactional process where they say, we'll support you on Israel, but we need your support on something. Never. In my experience, that has never happened. So if they wish to support Israel for their own reasons, my perspective is, thank you very much. And then as far as the rapture is concerned, forgive my lightheartedness, but if Jesus, or I'll put it differently, if the Messiah, the Mashiach, comes to earth, my view is, let's invite the Dalai Lama or some third party to meet and ask, is this your first visit or your second visit? If the answer is, it's my first visit, well, then we expect an apology from the other side. And if the response is, no, it's my second visit, will we be prepared to apologize? But until that moment comes, we at AJC can live with this status quo.
Então, David, depois dessa essa brilhante análise do diálogo inter-religioso, eu queria explorar um pouco a sua experiência com o diálogo intra-religioso e evidentemente que a gente pode dividir isso entre a discussão e o gap entre ortodoxos e não ortodoxos, liberais, seculares, mas também entre os judeus que vivem em Israel e o mundo judaico na diáspora. E nós aprendemos com a história como foi sempre muito importante a união de todas as nossas diferentes colorações. Eu queria a tua experiência, a sua visão sobre isso.
So here I would love, Mario, especially as an American who was raised on very optimistic Hollywood television shows and movies that always had a happy ending when I was growing up, I'd love to offer you a very sunny, optimistic answer. I'm not sure I can. The good news for me, and it's remarkable news, is we're here. And I think if you look historically, every generation, certainly in modern Jewish history, say from the 18th century forward, every generation thought it might be the last Jewish generation. And not simply because of Haman or Amalek or subsequently Hitler, but because of intermarriage, assimilation, and disappearance. It's a very, I mean, others have actually done a study on this, on the vanishing Jew in every generation. And yet here we are in 2021, continuing to debate this wonderfully urgent question, do we have a future? And my answer, without the ability to look into the future, but based on the past 3,500 years is, of course we have a future. Absolutely, we have a future. We didn't reach this point to simply vanish. But in each generation, we see forces at work that are often contradictory. We see new pockets of energy and vitality in the Jewish people. And we also see pockets that are leaving us. Not necessarily converting to another religion, though sometimes that, but sort of losing interest, asking the question, what does this all have to do with me in the 21st century? I am a modern, contemporary, cool, universal person. Of what interest is this Jewish baggage to me? So we have contradictory trends, and we have to recognize that various forces are working on us at once, some positive and constructive. I mean, I think, for example, Mario, I don't mean to get into the Argentine-Brazilian rivalry, which I know is like walking into a minefield in Beirut. But I grew up in a synagogue in New York, a conservative synagogue called B'nai Jeshurun. Now, when I was growing up, B'nai Jeshurun had once been this wonderfully traditional, revered, conservative synagogue. But by the 1960s, it was in steep decline. There were very few families still affiliated with it, and some people thought it was going to close its doors and maybe the building would go to a developer for a new apartment tower. And along came what became known as the Argentine model. And the first rabbi who brought this from Buenos Aires was Marshall Meyer. Ever since that point, with other Argentine rabbis, B'nai Jeshurun has completely turned around and transformed the Jewish landscape in much of New York, to the point, I believe, where for the Chagim, for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, they are holding services in as many as 4 different synagogues or churches or public halls, concert halls in New York City. So what I'm saying is you have these extraordinary spurts of energy on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have those who are leaving and those synagogues that are unable to answer the question, why be Jewish in the 21st century? So that's the first tug of war. The second tug of war, which I see here in the US, is between Jewish particularism and Jewish universalism. It's fascinating, and I'm sure the rabbi deals with this quite a bit in Sao Paulo as well, how for some people, the definition of Judaism for them becomes two words and two words alone, tikkun olam. That kind of sums it up, and that validates their Jewish behavior. Whereas for others, Jewish particularism, Jewish practice, Jewish observance, Jewish peoplehood are key elements of their identity. So if it's universalism based on tikkun olam, it's a wonderful notion for social justice, but is it enough to retain a distinctive Jewish identity? Do we Jews have a monopoly on social justice? If it's Jewish particularism, all well and good, but how do you explain to many, especially young people, that want to be a part of the larger world, how to create a balance between the universal and the particular? And I see in America, it's quite challenging. And the third thing I would say is the place of Israel in the consciousness of diaspora Jewry, but especially in this case, American Jewry. And I've traveled the world for AJC, Mario, and some of those trips have been together with you. And I think it's fair to say that while the American Jewish community is by far the largest, nearly 7 million, it's also in some respects the most complicated when it comes to expressing Jewish identity and expressing a connection to Israel. And we see it played out now. We see groups here in the United States that have organized around the principle that they know better what's good for Israel than Israel does, have no hesitation to go to the United States Congress, to the United States White House, and elsewhere, and actively oppose issues that Israel has defined as central to its agenda, including the 2015 Iran deal. And increasingly, we see this internal fractionalization around the issue of Israel as well. So it's wonderful to speak about Am Echad, Klal Yisrael, one people and the community of Israel. And I live it every day, but it's not a full picture. It's a partial picture. Because I live it because I found Mario Fleck in Sao Paulo. And I found communities like the Congregation Paulista, which we're speaking with. And so I live in that world of Jewish peoplehood and Jewish unity and Jewish Zionism. But I also know that there are large pockets around me that don't anymore. And will we bring them all back together again? I'm not terribly optimistic.
David, a minha próxima pergunta é sobre geopolítica. Será que existe uma forma de prever como que a pandemia vai impactar o equilíbrio de forças internacional? De que forma os Estados Unidos, a China, a Rússia, a Europa, os países árabes serão impactados pela pandemia e de que forma isso terá também um impacto sobre o povo judeu?
I wouldn't know where to begin. Although maybe, and I say this as an American, the key answer to your question, I believe, Rabbi, for me, geopolitically, begins with where will America be in the years ahead? Please don't interpret that as some kind of nationalistic response. Rather, I give that answer because the greatest power and the greatest force for democracy and human liberty, I believe, in the last period of history has been the United States. Now, I'm the first to admit as an American that our history is complicated. I'm not suggesting it's not. But at the end of the day, whether it was the First World War, whether it was the Second World War, whether it was the Cold War, without the United States, imagine what the world would have looked like, including the fact that many might have been speaking German. And you, Rabbi, and Mario, and I would not be having this conversation because we would not be here. So for me, geopolitically, what's most important in answering your question is, how do we restore the strength, a large consensus in the United States, and the right balance between our internal challenges and our external, both opportunities and obligations. If our country gets it right, and I would offer, for example, the presidency of Harry Truman from 1945 to 1953 as a wonderfully good example of a leader who got it right, and created many of the most important institutions that still govern our world. But we need that kind of leadership. So it's not the day-to-day political leadership that says, what are the polls saying? Am I popular? Am I not popular? If I do this, will I be more popular or that? We need leaders who have a vision and a spine and the courage to say, this is where we need to go. And I'm not going to put it up for a popularity contest. I'm elected. In 2 years or 4 years, the people will have the chance to re-elect me or reject me. But a leader leads. A leader should not follow. And we need a leader who leads, because managing the relationship with China unquestionably will be the single most important geopolitical challenge of the 21st century. And as the Biden administration has said, we need to separate the areas of potential cooperation from the areas of potential competition to the areas of potential conflict. I think it's a very good construct. Now, having constructed it verbally, we now have to operationalize it. Not simple, but urgently necessary. Russia, we've seen, is a major challenge. The hope of the 1990s, post-Soviet, with Boris Yeltsin as the leader, have now yielded to a kind of neo-Soviet mindset of a former KGB official named Vladimir Putin, who has managed to establish a way of retaining power now for 20 years and perhaps for many years more. If China and Russia move closer and closer to each other, that poses additional challenges. So we have to ask ourselves, what about centers of gravity like Europe? Is Europe simply going to be an economic and trading zone? Is Europe going to try to assert its own geopolitical power in a major way and as a force for democracy and human liberty and human dignity? A wonderful partner. What about India? A massively large country now focused almost exclusively on the pandemic, but you asked about post-pandemic, and there will be a day after. India represents a critically important country for the future of our world. The largest democracy, by the way, a great friend of Israel. And what about Latin America? I mean, we talk about Latin America periodically. The trajectory of Latin America is very complicated. You know that better than we do. It's not a straight line. It has its zigs and its zags. It steps forward, it steps back. It's moved towards democracy. It's moved towards autocracy and populism. always the promise of mañana, sometimes fulfilled, sometimes not. But within Latin America, the single most consequential country, and here with great respect to Argentina, is Brazil. By the size of your population, by the size of your economy, by the size of your landmass. So you tell me the future of Brazil, and I'll tell you the direction of Latin America. So I think as we look around the world, and last but not least, I would just say one word about Africa. It obviously warrants much more. But from a geopolitical perspective, Africa offers lots of opportunity because it's still developing, but enormous challenges. Demographic challenges, population growth that outpaces job opportunities, job creation, climate change, and the impact on basic food security, stable versus unstable governments. If Africa succeeds, the world will move in one direction. But if many of the countries of Africa should not succeed, we're going to have major migration flows, more concern about climate change. So there are lots of issues, Rabbi, that focus on individual countries, larger continents, and then trends across like migration, like climate change, like corruption, like narco trafficking. We need leadership. In other words, we need strong, democratic, enlightened, courageous, visionary leadership to get us through this. And that's what I hope we will see in these countries.
A última pergunta, a gente está chegando, infelizmente, ao fim dessa excelente conversa, e eu queria fazer uma pergunta pessoal para o David. Por que o judaísmo é importante para David Harris?
You wait till the end, knowing that we only have 2 or 3 minutes. when this is a potential book one day, Mario. I would say, and I cannot do the question justice, but I would say, number one, I've always been a proud Jew from a very early age. I never wanted to be anything else. And I do not come, Mario, from a religious family. My father, may he rest in peace, did not know the difference between Purim and Pesach and really did not care. But there was, first and foremost to me, a pride in being Jewish. Secondly, there was a sense of great satisfaction in having a lifelong ethical search for the larger questions of life and what Judaism could bring to that search. Thirdly, I had a family, the Jewish family. I travel a lot, Mario, as I said. The sense of pleasure in arriving in São Paulo or in Santiago or in Lima or in Bogota or anywhere else, and immediately connecting with other Jews on a deeply metaphysical level is something that gives me a kind of a home and a harbor in this big turbulent world. And of course, Israel is at the center of that for me. And one last thought, again, this is way too quick. I grew up very secular. In the 1970s, I went to the Soviet Union, a long story, and then afterwards spent years in Italy and Austria working with Jews able to leave the Soviet Union. And many of those Jews would ask me questions when they arrived. They just arrived in the West for the first time, and they didn't know what Rosh Hashanah was. They didn't know what Shabbat was. They didn't know what Yom Kippur was. Many of them knew nothing. And they'd ask me questions. Sometimes I barely knew the answer. Sometimes I didn't know the answer. They had a good excuse, Mario. They had just come from the Soviet Union. I had just come from New York, where there's a synagogue on every second block. So to avoid embarrassment in a pre-Google era, I began collecting books and reading about basic Judaism. Why Shabbat? Why the holidays? What's the Talmud? The Psalms. And you know, I still remember I was in my mid-20s. On the one hand, I was becoming increasingly enriched. And on the other hand, I was angry that I had been deprived of this rich heritage and legacy for the first 25 years of my life. So I thank Soviet Jews who asked me basic questions that forced me to go to libraries like the one behind you and try and avoid embarrassment. And the more I discovered, the more I stood tall. I was standing on 3,500 years of history, not just survival. We're all proud of surviving, but surviving for what? For what? For the sake of survival? No, for the sake of a purpose. There is a Jewish purpose to life and to life's journey. And I discovered it. And it's been incredibly enriching and inspiring and emboldening for me ever since.
Thank you very much, David. As I said, always the conversation with you is a big source of inspiration and learning, and you did it again. So we appreciate very much your time, your thoughts, and your contribution in these fields for us. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Mario. Thank you, Rabbi. It was a great honor and privilege to be with you.
Como eu disse aqui para o David, David é sempre uma fonte de inspiração e um aprendizado, um exemplo de um líder da comunidade judaica que tem desenhado os capítulos mais recentes dessa arquitetura de uma história milenar. É um prazer, uma honra ter tido aqui essa conversa com você, Michel, no Dilemas Éticos, trazendo um personagem tão importante do mundo judaico contemporâneo. Muito obrigado.
Thank you.